Hey guys, Anthony Santo here from myrecordinginternship.com. I'm here to talk to you about signal processing. We're going to talk about sample rate and bit depth. Let's get involved real quickly. This is my first little diagram I'd like to show you. What happens is we get a sound wave. We enter the sound wave into a microphone. It turns it into an electrical voltage. The electrical voltage is read by your computer's analog to digital converter. Then it's converted into a digital binary data. The binary data is then affected in your DAW, your digital audio workstation. It comes out of your DAW through a digital to analog converter. It is now electrical voltage, which is sent to a speaker, and it creates sound waves. So, what are sound waves should be your first question here, so let's dig into that first. Sound waves are really simple to explain. It is just when air gets either compressed or rarefied. So when there is more air pushed close together, or there is less air than there normally is. When you're at a point that air is just consistently the same, there's no extra pressure or rarefied air, you wind up having silence. So we have a diagram of a tuning fork here. This tuning fork, when you hit it, you can kind of see what it does. It'll push away, making this air here closer together, and then it'll go towards itself, making the air following it further apart. So that is compressed air and rarefied air, and it'll go back and forth compressing and rarefying the air, and that makes a sound wave. So the sound wave looks like this: compressed air and then rarefied air. And the up-down is your amplitude, the left-right is your time. Time, when you're looking at this, time is frequency. So we're talking about one cycle. So if we have one cycle, the frequency of this wave over time is how we figure out how many hertz it is. So if this signal was 20 hertz, this frequency would happen 20 times per second. So in 1 second, this would happen 20 times if you're at 20 hertz. And that's how you understand hertz to begin with. So if we're at 50, it happens 50 times. If we're at 1,000, it happens 1,000 times. But this is a good diagram to kind of understand where we're getting everything from. Now, the air is hitting the microphone, and it is getting converted into a digital signal. This chart will help us out with that a bit. The x-axis, that is your horizontal axis, is your sampling frequency. Your y-axis, that is your vertical axis, is your bit depth. So along the x-axis, we'll see there's not a ton of samples here, but your sampling frequency, your sampling rate are the same thing. So if your sample rate was 44,100 samples at your normal 44.1, you would have 44,100 different spots within 1 second that it will sample the analog signal. So when it samples the analog signal, it doesn't get a continuous signal. It isn't sampling it constantly. It's sampling it at these intervals. And if we're at 44,100 times per second. When it does that, it stores the information in digital data. Now, it needs to go ahead and put this signal back together, and it does that just by connecting the lines, basically. They like to say the word interpolation a lot, meaning that they connect the lines to the best of their knowledge of how a waveform normally would form. So they do it through interpolation a lot, but if you sample at a high enough frequency, you don't have to worry too much about getting that digital sound that you would get without smoothing out the slopes of the in-betweens of your sampling. So what is bit depth? Bit depth will be your other axis, your y-axis. So your bit depth has to do with how many different amplitudes you're able to sample at. So I liked this diagram because we had bit depth 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's very simplified, but you'll see what happens in this sort of situation if we sample and it samples right here at 4.7, 4.8-ish. If our bit depth only allows it to be seen at 4 or 5, it needs to be rounded to the nearest number. So it will be rounded up to 5. So your bit depth has to do with your amplitude and how many different points of amplitude are allowed to be sampled. So it all has to do with quantizing. So we're either quantizing at your sample frequency, your sample rate, or we're quantizing at a bit depth. Both of those things are very important as the signal now gets out of your computer through your digital to analog processor and goes back to being a voltage signal. Let's go back to the top. Now, when we get back to being a voltage signal like we saw here, here's our voltage signal. And in this, when you're looking at this diagram, you have time and amplitude. When you're in voltage, you still have time, and this would just be voltage instead of amplitude. And voltage would equal your amplitude. That's why you have these VCA faders, these voltage controlled amplifier faders and so on. This is what this means. You adjust the voltage and you can make it louder or softer. And that's what you're doing when you're working with your home speaker. You're adjusting the amount of power going to it. You're not just, oh yeah, be louder. You're actually adjusting the electric that's going to it. So we made our way back to electrical voltage. That will go and become a sound wave through your speaker, and your speaker will do that by what we said at the beginning, by compressing and rarefying the air. Now, one more thing I want to mention is that there is something called the Nyquist frequency. So when you have a sample rate, you have a sample rate of 44,100. The Nyquist frequency is always half of the sample rate because you need, in order to sample a frequency, be able to catch it at its top point and bottom point. You can't just catch one of them or you can't get the frequency. So when you look at this, you're going to need to catch the compression and the rarefaction. If you're able to catch both of those, you can sample that frequency. So at 44,100, we could sample frequencies over 22,000 hertz. Normal hearing stops at 20,000 hertz. So we're able to capture higher frequencies than we can actually hear. I hope that helps you understand why 44.1 is normal. Understand that doing it at 88.2 or 48 or 96, they have their own purposes. And I know I mentioned in another video that 48 is very, very common in video. When you're doing audio for video, 48 lines up better with their frame rate a lot of the time. I don't know a ton about video, so if you want to do some research on that, go ahead. Now let's talk about bit depth. Bit depth, people will think of bit depth and go, wow, it's 8 bits, so it only has 8 different spots for it to signal an amplitude. That's not the case. Bit depth works at exponential rates. When you want to do bit depth, you say 2 to the power of bit depth. So 2 to the power of 16 or 2 to the power of 24, and you get massive numbers. Thousands of places at which you could hit a different type of amplitude. So I hope this helps you out, and I'm going to tag a video that has a bunch more information and shows this at work in Pro Tools so that you can get a little more background on this and really let it soak in. All right, thanks for being with me. Here's the next video. Hey guys, Anthony Santo here from myrecordinginternship.com. I'm here with a quick start guide for sample rate and bit depth. Here's how I'll get you started right away. Normally in audio, we use 44.1 as our sample rate. That's 44.1K. And our bit depth is usually 24 bits. That's usually enough for us to run everything that we want and be perfectly fine, have enough depth and enough samples to get the frequencies and to get the amount of quantization down to a limit that you can't hear it. So if you want to turn off the video right now, that's great. Here's what you need to know. Also, if you're working with video instead of just audio, you might want to change your sample rate to 48. It has to do with their frame rate, but just keep that in mind. You might want to talk to the people you're working with their video and so on. But let's bring it back to why we want to go to 44.1 sample rate. We'll start with that. There's a thing called the Nyquist frequency. It is a sample rate divided by 2. So if we're at 44,100 samples per second, the highest rate that we could hear is about 22,000 hertz. So that's higher than humans can hear. Humans hearing pretty much has gone after 20,000 hertz. So we're from about 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz we can hear. So a sample rate of 44.1 leaves us even some room higher than that, which is important. So what I did here is I put everything into sample mode. We have a grid in sample mode. If you could just check this out here. So every one of these grid points is one sample. Now, I have a 200 hertz sample on the top. A 200 hertz sample goes up and down like this from here to the next time it reaches the line here, and goes up and down 200 times within 1 second. So we'll zoom out, we'll see the 1 second mark, and I'm going to zoom out some more. Here's our 1 second mark. So from the beginning to here, this happened 200 times up and down. That makes it 200 hertz. Now, when we go to higher frequencies, 5,000 hertz, this will happen 5,000 times within a second. 10,000 will happen 10,000 times within a second, and so on and so on. So now that we know that this line, how quickly these lines move up and down, corresponds with the frequency of the signal. So when we have something sampled at 44,100 times per second, like this is being done, 44,100 times per second, we get this discrete signal that's different than our analog signal. See, our analog signal is a continuous signal. There's no sampling involved at all. It's constantly happening through compressing air and rarefying air. They call it rarefaction and compression. So when you see a string go back and forth, it should look exactly like this. So when it's going forward, it compresses air towards the microphone, and we reach up to here. And when it moves backwards, it moves air away from the microphone. So there's not much air reaching it at that time. So the up and down, that's your positive compression, that's your rarefaction. So compressed air, rarefied air. That's what we're seeing there. Now, when we usually hear things, what happens is they go into a microphone and they're changed to voltage signals. So we have positive voltage, negative voltage, positive voltage, negative voltage. Now, when they come into a computer, we have discrete signals. Discrete signals go like this. Every one of these samples, this one, this one, this one, this one, every single one of these has an entry. It'll be a binary entry, zeros and ones, that correspond with a dot up here telling you where the signal was at each sample. Now, the computer needs to now connect each one of them, and you don't even connect it with a straight line. They're able to use interpolation so that the lines aren't completely straight, because if they were completely straight, it would sound very digital and it would sound bad. So they go ahead and they do the whole, hey, we're going to move up and down in a smooth way rather than just a strict straight way everywhere. That's what your DAW is doing. So you sample a whole bunch within this one signal, because at 200 hertz, your 44,000 samples has a lot more places to sample within one wave than, say, 5,000 hertz. So let's look at the 5,000 hertz signal and figure out what's different about it. What you're going to see right away is this signal starts to get a little bit more jagged. See, there was a sample hit right here and a sample hit right here. And what happened is you had a straight line to that. So when you have more samples, the line isn't as straight. So that's really the basics of everything we need to know about sample rate. Now, let's look a little bit more into how jagged this can get. And then we're going to see why we need 2 samples per frequency, why the Nyquist frequency exists. See, now this one is twice as much as the 5,000 hertz. We get to 10,000 hertz, and we're seeing even more sharpness to our signal. But what's important is that there is a positive and there is a negative. In order to sample it, we need 2 samples, because one has to capture positive, one has to capture negative. We won't get the frequency. We won't be able to find the frequency if we can't sample at the positive and the negative. So when we get to 2,000 hertz, now this is basically our sample rate, very close to it. All we have is positive, negative, positive, negative. It's really just sampling the up and down here, and it's going to do it in a pretty strict way. It's not going to be as smooth as you might want it to be, so you can upsample there. Go ahead and pick it up to 88 or 96 or whatever you'd like it to use if you really, really want to hear 20,000 hertz, which you probably don't, and that's why we don't use it. All right, so now that we have that figured out, I want to talk just a little bit about signals reflecting back into the plane. So this won't happen on your DAW very often at all unless you're using plugins. Now, plugins that create distortion, they wind up doing harmonic distortion. So say we have harmonic distortion, and on this signal, that's 20,000 hertz already, and it's hitting the 20,000 hertz, and it's exciting its harmonic, which would be 40,000 hertz, which we cannot sample. So what happens to that signal? That signal will get reflected back into the field. Fairly randomly, we could probably do the math behind it, but it's unnecessary. If you're hearing this computerized sound of distortion, that's called aliasing, and that is because you're sampling too low in order for you to catch all of that distortion. So if they are harmonics high, real high harmonics, because of the distortion plugin you're using, you might get some aliasing. A lot of plugins do something called upsampling within the plugin, where they add some samples to that plugin as well. They'll upsample everything. So even though your session might be at 44.1, they might have upsampled it to 88 so that they could take that 40,000 hertz and not let it get all screwed up back into the signal. And your DAW won't allow the 40,000 hertz to be heard at all. It already handles that for you. So that's really, really important. Okay, so we covered Nyquist frequency and we covered sample rate. So what is bit depth? Bit depth is simple. You saw that we were taking the Nyquist frequency, we were taking measurements of the frequency by going this way across. We're going, wow, look how many times it goes up and down over a period of time. Now, if we want to get into bit depth, we want to go into how close can we get the amplitude. So the amplitude here we could see is right there, and the amplitude here we could see is right there. Now, if we have a very small bit depth, say we have a bit depth of, let's say 4 bits. If we have 4 bits, the way we find how many different places it will quantize the amplitude to, it'll round the amplitude to. Now remember, your amplitude is now just these lines going across basically. Instead of up and down, there's lines going across. Here's your 0 amplitude, and your positive ones are up here. And your negatives are down there and just going sideways, going horizontally. Now, if we're looking at that, now we have, what happens is, it's really simple when we talk about bit depth. When we have bit depth, all you have to do is take the number 2, go power 2, and then bit depth. So 2 to the power of 4, or 2 to the power of 2, or 2 to the power of 8, or usually what we have is 2 to the power of 16 or 2 to the power of 24. I can go ahead and do those calculations, throw them up if we need to. But you get it, that it's not 8 different spots that it can hit here for the amplitude. It is thousands of different spots once we reach 16, and probably hundreds of thousands. We'll get the number once we reach 24. So if we sample and we have a bit depth here, where we can sample, let's say, to the nearest decibel. Because it only allows to the nearest decibel. That's our bit depth. It's a very, very low bit depth. And we have this sampled here, and this is actually 0.6, and this one's actually 0.7. They're all going to be quantized, rounded to 1 decibel. All of them will be rounded to 1 decibel, which we don't want. So we want bigger bit depths. And as we increase our bit depth, that rounding gets smaller and smaller. So the quantation gets smaller in that direction. So we already see here with the sample rate, we're quantizing to samples. And then we're filling in the gaps. The computer's filling in the gaps so we can play it back as an analog signal. Now, on the bit depth, we're now filling in the horizontal. So now when we sample, it can sample to a finer rate of amplitude. So it samples to a better amplitude or a closer amplitude. You won't want to say better. You might not like how close it gets. So we will go up and down to an amplitude that will correspond with that sample. So every one of those samples will have an amplitude. Then they will be connected. They work together. They need to work together. That's what sample rate and bit depth is. All right. So how does this happen? Let's just talk about what I said in the beginning with air. When you're hearing sound, air gets compressed and rarefied, and it vibrates your eardrum. So that's what's happening, and your microphone picks up that analog signal and throws it to your computer. It goes through analog to digital converters. Those converters run at a sample rate and a bit depth in order to track the amplitude at each sample. That's what we have here. And then after you want to play it back, it turns it from that digital, just binary code of zeros and ones back into a signal, trying to make it as smooth as possible using interpolation. And you hear back a voltage signal through speakers. And the speakers play the voltage signal. The voltage moves the air, compresses and rarefies it. It hits your eardrum, and now you hear the sound. So that is sample rate. That is bit depth. I hope this one helped you out. I hope you understand it a little more, and we will talk again soon.